Hello everyone, I am Mr. Disturbing, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Ezra Whitmore was 23 years old when he first heard tell of the woman in white who walked the ridges above Copper Creek. He'd been living in the holler all his life, born and raised in the same weathered cabin his great-grandfather had built with his own two hands back in 1892. The mountains of eastern Kentucky had been his whole world, and he figured they always would be. The old-timers would gather on the porch of Henley's General Store come evenings, whittling and spitting tobacco juice into rusted coffee cans while they shared stories that had been passed down through generations like worn-out quilts. Most of the tales were familiar ones. The beast that walked on two legs up on Devil's Backbone, the lights that danced through the trees on moonless nights, the voices that called your name from empty hollers. But the story of the woman in white was different somehow. When old Silas Henley told it, his voice would drop to barely above a whisper, and even the cicadas seemed to quiet down to listen. "She'd been seen," Silas said, standing among the birch trees where the old Cherokee trail wound up toward the ridge, always facing away from whoever spotted her, her long white dress flowing in breezes that never seemed to touch anything else. Hunters would catch glimpses of her through the trees, pale as moonlight against the dark bark. Some said she was the spirit of a woman who'd lost her way in the mountains during the harsh winter of 1918, found frozen solid come spring with her face turned away from the wind. Others claimed she was older than that, old as the mountains themselves, a guardian or warning left by the Cherokee before they were driven out on the Trail of Tears. But there was one detail that made even the bravest men shift uncomfortably in their seats. If you called out to her, if you tried to get her attention, she would turn around. And when she did, you'd see that her face wasn't where it ought to be. Instead of finding familiar features arranged in the proper order, you'd be staring at the back of her head, her dark hair hanging limp and lifeless. Her true face, they said, was on the back of her skull, twisted and wrong, with eyes that had seen things no mortal soul should ever witness. Ezra had always been skeptical of such stories. His mama had raised him to be practical, to trust in hard work and common sense rather than mountain superstitions, but something about the way the old men told this particular tale made the hair on his arms stand up. Maybe it was the way Silas's rheumy eyes would dart toward the tree line while he spoke, or how even the dogs seemed to slink away when the story was being told. The autumn of 1947 had been particularly harsh. The first frost came early, killing off the last of the tobacco before it could be properly harvested. Ezra's daddy had taken sick with a fever that wouldn't break, and the doctor from town was asking for more money than the family had ever seen. That's what drove Ezra up into the high country on that October evening, looking for the old Cherokee burial ground where, according to local legend, certain valuable plants grew that didn't take root anywhere else. The ginseng that grew near the ancient graves was said to be especially potent, worth good money to the medicine men who traveled through the mountains buying such things. Ezra didn't much believe in the healing properties of roots and herbs, but he believed in the cash they could bring. His daddy needed medicine, real medicine from the doctor in town, and that required real money. He'd started the climb just after noon, figuring he'd have plenty of daylight to find what he was looking for and make it back down before dark. The trail was well worn in places, less so in others, winding up through stands of oak and hickory that were just beginning to show their autumn colors. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke from some distant cabin and the earthy smell of leaves beginning their slow decay. As he climbed higher, the trees began to change. The hardwoods gave way to pine and spruce, and the familiar sounds of the lower elevations faded behind him. Up here, the silence was different, thicker somehow, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. His boots crunched on fallen needles, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot seemed to echo longer than it should have. By the time he reached the ridge where the Cherokee burial ground was supposed to be, the sun was already sinking low in the western sky. The light had taken on that golden quality that comes just before evening, slanting through the trees in long, dusty shafts. Ezra paused to catch his breath and get his bearings, looking around for any sign of the ancient graves he'd been told to look for. The burial ground, when he finally found it, was nothing like what he'd expected. Instead of marked graves or stone monuments, there was simply a clearing among the pines where nothing seemed to grow except for moss and a few scattered wildflowers. The trees formed a rough circle around the space, their branches reaching inward as if trying to reclaim what had been taken from them. The silence here was absolute, so complete that Ezra could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. He spent the better part of an hour searching the edges of the clearing, looking for the telltale three-pronged leaves of wild ginseng. The light was fading fast now, and he was beginning to think he'd have to come back another day when he spotted them. A cluster of the precious plants growing in the shadow of a massive pine tree at the far edge of the clearing. The ginseng was everything the stories had promised. The plants were larger than any he'd seen before, their leaves a deep, healthy green despite the lateness of the season. The roots, when he carefully dug them up, were thick and gnarled, heavy with the weight of years. He wrapped them carefully in the cloth sack he'd brought, his heart racing with the knowledge that what he'd found would be worth enough to pay for his daddy's medicine and then some. It was as he was packing the last of the roots away that he heard it. A sound so soft he almost missed it. It was like the whisper of fabric against tree bark or the gentle sigh of wind through leaves. But there was no wind. The evening air was perfectly still, so still that the smoke from his breath hung in the air like ghostly fingers. Ezra straightened up slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the hunting knife at his belt. The sound came again, clearer this time, and he realized it was the soft rustle of cloth, as if someone were moving through the trees just beyond the clearing. His first thought was that he wasn't alone up here, that maybe another hunter or herb gatherer had come looking for the same treasures he'd found. He called out, his voice sounding strange and hollow in the stillness. The rustling stopped immediately, leaving behind a silence so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums. For a long moment nothing happened. Then, slowly, he saw her. She was standing among the birch trees at the far edge of the clearing, exactly as the old stories had described. Her dress was white as fresh snow, flowing and ethereal in the fading light. Her hair was long and dark, hanging straight down her back like a curtain of shadows. She stood perfectly still, facing away from him, her entire posture suggesting someone lost in thought or grief. Ezra's first instinct was relief. Here was another person, someone who could perhaps help him find his way back down the mountain in the growing darkness. But something about her stillness, about the way she seemed to blend with the shadows between the trees, made him hesitate. The stories came rushing back to him. Old Silas's whispered warnings about the woman in white who walked the ridges above Copper Creek. But those were just stories, weren't they? Mountain folklore passed down by people who'd had too much corn liquor and too little education. This was just a woman, probably lost or in trouble, standing alone in the gathering darkness. It would be wrong, unchristian even, to just walk away without offering help. He took a step forward, and then another. The woman didn't move, didn't seem to notice his approach. As he got closer, he could see that her dress was old-fashioned, the kind his grandmother might have worn to church, with long sleeves and a high collar. The fabric seemed to glow faintly in the twilight, as if it were made of moonlight itself. When he was about 20 feet away, he called out again, louder this time. His voice echoed strangely among the trees, seeming to come from all directions at once. The woman still didn't move, didn't acknowledge his presence in any way. It was as if she were carved from marble, a statue left behind by some forgotten sculptor. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl and the soft whisper of wind through the pines. Ezra felt his heart begin to race, though he couldn't say why. There was something wrong here, something that made every instinct he'd inherited from generations of mountain folk scream at him to turn around and run, but he couldn't leave her there. Whatever was wrong, whatever danger she might be in, he had to try to help. That's what his mama had taught him, what his daddy had shown him by example. You didn't turn your back on someone in need, no matter how strange the circumstances. He took another step forward, close enough now that he could have reached out and touched her if he'd wanted to. The fabric of her dress seemed to shimmer in the dying light, and he could see that it was covered in delicate embroidery, patterns that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. When he called out the third time, his voice was barely above a whisper. But somehow, impossibly, she heard him. Her head began to turn, slowly, deliberately, like the hands of a clock marking the passage of time. The movement was wrong somehow, too smooth, too controlled, as if her neck were made of something other than flesh and bone. As her head turned, Ezra caught a glimpse of her profile, or what should have been her profile. But there was nothing there, just the side of her head covered by that dark curtain of hair. No eye, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth, pale skin stretched over bone. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't right. People didn't look like that. People couldn't look like that. But she was still turning, still moving with that horrible, mechanical precision, and he found himself frozen in place, unable to move or speak or even breathe. When she had turned completely around, when she was facing him fully, Ezra saw the truth of what the old stories had tried to tell him. Where her face should have been, there was only the back of her head, hair hanging in limp strands that seemed to move with a life of their own. But it was what he saw below the hairline that made his blood turn to ice in his veins. Her face was there, but it was on the back of her head, nestled where the base of her skull met her neck. The features were human but wrong, as if someone had taken a normal face and stretched it, twisted it, rearranged it according to some mad artist's vision. The eyes were too large, too dark, and they seemed to hold depths that went on forever. The mouth was a gash of red in the pale flesh, lips pulled back in what might have been a smile or might have been a snarl. But it was the expression in those impossible eyes that broke something inside Ezra's mind. There was such sadness there, such infinite loneliness and pain, that he felt tears start to run down his cheeks. This wasn't a monster or a demon or any of the other things the stories had made her out to be. This was a woman, or had been once, trapped in something she couldn't escape, condemned to walk the ridges forever with her face turned away from the world. The backward face spoke then, though the mouth didn't move. The voice came from somewhere else, from the air itself, from the trees and the stones and the very ground beneath his feet. It was a woman's voice, sweet and sad and infinitely weary, speaking words in a language he didn't recognize but somehow understood. She told him her story without words, filling his mind with images and emotions that were not his own. She had been Cherokee, one of the last to leave when the soldiers came with their guns and their papers and their promises of a better life in the West. She had hidden in the mountains, refusing to abandon the graves of her ancestors, living wild and free in the high places where the white men's axes had not yet fallen. But freedom had come with a price. The loneliness had been crushing, the isolation complete. She had begun to forget what it was like to see another human face, to hear another voice raised in laughter or song. Slowly, gradually, she had begun to change, her body responding to the deep need to see, to connect, to be part of something larger than herself. The change had been gradual at first, a tingling in her scalp, a strange sensation at the base of her skull. But over the months and years, her face had begun to migrate, sliding around her head like water seeking its level. She had tried to stop it, tried to force her features back where they belonged, but the change was stronger than her will. By the time she realized what was happening, it was too late. Her face had settled into its new position, and she found herself trapped between worlds, no longer fully human, but not yet something else entirely. She could see the world behind her, could watch the endless succession of seasons and years, but she could never again look forward, never again see what lay ahead. The soldiers had found her eventually, of course. They had come with their dogs and their torches, hunting for the last of the Cherokee holdouts. But when they saw what she had become, they had fled in terror, leaving her alone on the ridge with nothing but the wind and the stars for company. She had tried to die, had walked into the deepest snow and the coldest winds, but death would not take her. She was caught between life and death, between human and spirit, condemned to walk the ridges forever, searching for something she could never find. As the story filled his mind, Ezra felt his heart breaking for her. This was no monster to be feared, but a woman in pain, a soul in torment. Without thinking, he took a step forward, reaching out his hand as if to comfort her. The moment his fingers touched her dress, everything changed. The world tilted and spun, and suddenly he was seeing through her eyes, looking backward at the path he had taken to reach this place. He could see his own body standing there, hand outstretched, face filled with compassion and horror. But he could also see further back, down the mountain and through the trees, to places he had never been but somehow knew intimately. He saw the cabin where he had been born, where his daddy lay dying of fever. He saw his mama sitting by the bedside, holding the old man's hand and whispering prayers. He saw the doctor in town, counting coins and shaking his head at the paltry amount the Whitmore family could afford to pay. He saw it all, but he saw it backward, as if time itself were running in reverse. And then he saw something else, something that made his blood run cold. There were others on the mountain, other figures in white moving through the trees. Some were men, some were women, but all of them had the same terrible affliction. Faces that had migrated to the backs of their heads, eyes that looked forever into the past. They were drawn to the ridge, he realized, drawn by the same force that had claimed the Cherokee woman. Everyone who had ever felt truly alone, truly isolated, truly lost in the depths of the mountains, they all eventually found their way here, to this place where the boundary between human and spirit was thin as morning mist. The woman's backward face was speaking again, but this time the words were in English, though they seemed to come from very far away. She was telling him that he didn't have to be alone anymore, that he could stay here with her and the others, that they could keep each other company through the long, dark nights. All he had to do was accept it, accept the change that was already beginning in his own body. He could feel it starting, a warm tingling at the base of his skull, a strange pulling sensation as if something were trying to turn his head around. It would be so easy to let it happen, to give in to the loneliness that had been his constant companion for so long. But then he thought of his daddy, lying sick in bed, depending on him to bring back the medicine money. He thought of his mama, worn down by years of hard living but still fighting to keep the family together. He thought of all the people in the holler who knew his name, who would nod and speak when they saw him in town. As the story filled his mind, Ezra felt his heart breaking for her. This was no monster to be feared, but a woman in pain, a soul in torment. Without thinking, he took a step forward, reaching out his hand as if to comfort her. The moment his fingers touched her dress, everything changed. The world tilted and spun, and suddenly he was seeing through her eyes, looking backward at the path he had taken to reach this place. He could see his own body standing there, hand outstretched, face filled with compassion and horror. But he could also see further back, down the mountain and through the trees, to places he had never been but somehow knew intimately. He saw the cabin where he had been born, where his daddy lay dying of fever. He saw his mama sitting by the bedside, holding the old man's hand and whispering prayers. He saw the doctor in town, counting coins and shaking his head at the paltry amount the Whitmore family could afford to pay. He saw it all, but he saw it backward, as if time itself were running in reverse. And then he saw something else, something that made his blood run cold. There were others on the mountain, other figures in white moving through the trees. Some were men, some were women, but all of them had the same terrible affliction. Faces that had migrated to the backs of their heads, eyes that looked forever into the past. They were drawn to the ridge, he realized, drawn by the same force that had claimed the Cherokee woman. Everyone who had ever felt truly alone, truly isolated, truly lost in the depths of the mountains, they all eventually found their way here, to this place where the boundary between human and spirit was thin as morning mist. The woman's backward face was speaking again, but this time the words were in English, though they seemed to come from very far away. She was telling him that he didn't have to be alone anymore, that he could stay here with her and the others, that they could keep each other company through the long, dark nights. All he had to do was accept it, accept the change that was already beginning in his own body. He could feel it starting, a warm tingling at the base of his skull, a strange pulling sensation as if something were trying to turn his head around. It would be so easy to let it happen, to give in to the loneliness that had been his constant companion for so long. But then he thought of his daddy, lying sick in bed, depending on him to bring back the medicine money. He thought of his mama, worn down by years of hard living but still fighting to keep the family together. He thought of all the people in the holler who knew his name, who would nod and speak when they saw him in town. He wasn't alone. He had never been alone. The mountains had made him think he was, had whispered lies about isolation and abandonment until he almost believed them. But the truth was different. The truth was that he was part of something larger, a community that stretched back generations and forward into a future he couldn't see. With tremendous effort, he pulled his hand back from the woman's dress. The world snapped back into focus, and he found himself standing in the clearing once again, facing the backward woman in her flowing white gown. But now he could see her clearly, could see the trap she represented and the choice she was offering. The sun had set while he'd been lost in her story, and the moon was beginning to rise through the trees. In its pale light, he could see the other figures moving through the forest, all of them drawn to the ridge by the same promise of companionship that had nearly claimed him. He backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off the woman's terrible backward face. She didn't try to follow him, didn't try to stop him from leaving. She just stood there among the birch trees, as still as death, watching him with those impossible eyes. As he reached the edge of the clearing, she spoke one last time. Her voice was filled with infinite sadness, but also with something that might have been understanding. She told him that the choice would always be there, that the ridge would always be waiting for him if he ever changed his mind. All he had to do was come back alone, come back when the loneliness became too much to bear. Ezra turned and ran then, crashing through the underbrush and scrambling down the mountain trail as fast as his legs would carry him. Behind him he could hear the soft whisper of fabric against tree bark, the gentle sigh of wind through leaves. But he didn't look back. He couldn't look back. The trip down the mountain passed in a blur of moonlight and shadow. He stumbled and fell more than once, cutting his hands on sharp rocks and thorns, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop, not until he saw the warm yellow glow of lamplight in the windows of his family's cabin, not until he heard his mama's voice calling his name. When he finally burst through the front door, his mama took one look at his face and knew something terrible had happened. But he couldn't tell her about the woman in white, couldn't explain about the backward face or the choice he'd almost made. Instead, he just held up the sack of ginseng roots and told her that Daddy was going to get his medicine. The roots were worth more than he'd dared to hope. The medicine man who traveled through the mountains every few months took one look at them and counted out enough money to pay for the doctor's visit and a month's worth of medicine besides. Ezra's daddy recovered quickly once he got the proper treatment, and life in the holler returned to something approaching normal. But Ezra was never quite the same after that night on the ridge. He still went into the mountains, still hunted and trapped and gathered herbs like he always had. But he never went alone anymore. He always took someone with him, a neighbor, a cousin, one of the younger boys from down the holler who wanted to learn the old ways. He told himself it was just practical, that it was safer to travel in groups. But he knew the real reason. The woman in white was still up there, still walking the ridges above Copper Creek. And sometimes, on the loneliest nights, when the wind was howling through the trees and the cabin felt too small and the world felt too big, he could hear her calling his name. He never answered. He never went back to the ridge alone. But he knew, with the certainty that comes from looking into something far older and stranger than human understanding, that she was still there waiting. The backward face was still watching the path he had taken, still offering the same terrible choice to anyone who climbed high enough and stayed long enough to listen. Years passed, and Ezra grew older. He married a girl from the next holler over, had children of his own, built a life that was full of noise and laughter and the thousand small joys that come from being part of something larger than yourself. But he never forgot the woman in white, never forgot the sadness in those impossible eyes or the choice she had offered him. Sometimes, when his own children were old enough to understand, he would tell them about the mountains, about the importance of staying together, of never wandering too far from home alone. He never told them the whole story. That was too dangerous, too tempting for young minds that hadn't yet learned to fear the right things. But he made sure they understood that the mountains held secrets, that some places were better left unexplored. The old-timers still gathered on the porch of Henley's general store, still told their stories to anyone who would listen. But Ezra noticed that the tale of the woman in white was told less and less often. Maybe it was because the world was changing, because young people were leaving the mountains for jobs in the cities, because the old ways were being forgotten in favor of new ones. Or maybe it was because those who had seen her, those who had looked into that backward face and heard her story, knew better than to speak of it too freely. Some stories, Ezra had learned, were too dangerous to tell. Some truths were better left buried in the shadows between the trees where they belonged. But on certain nights, when the moon was full and the wind was still, if you knew where to look and how to listen, you could still catch glimpses of white fabric moving through the birch trees on the ridge above Copper Creek. And sometimes, if you were very quiet and very still, you could hear her calling, not to anyone in particular, but to the loneliness that lives in every human heart, the isolation that waits in the spaces between one soul and another. The woman with the backward face was still there, still walking, still waiting. And she always would be, as long as there were mountains to climb and people to lose themselves in the endless, terrible freedom of the high places where the wind never stops and the silence never ends. Ezra lived to be an old man, surrounded by children and grandchildren, his life full of love and laughter and the simple satisfactions of work well done. But even at the end, even when he was lying in his bed with his family gathered around him, he could still hear her voice on the wind, still see that backward face watching him with eyes that held all the loneliness in the world. He never went back to the ridge. He never answered her call, but he knew as he drew his last breath that she was still there, still waiting, still offering the same choice to anyone brave enough or foolish enough to climb high enough to find her. The woman in white walks the ridges still, they say. She walks them now, as she walked them then, as she will walk them always. And if you ever find yourself alone in the high places, if you ever feel the weight of isolation pressing down on your shoulders like a stone, you might catch a glimpse of white fabric moving through the trees. But if you do, if you see her standing there among the birch trees with her back turned to the world, don't call out to her. Don't try to get her attention. And whatever you do, don't look into that backward face. Don't let her tell you her story. Because once you've seen her, once you've heard her voice and felt the terrible pull of her loneliness, you'll never be quite the same. You'll spend the rest of your days listening for her call, feeling the tug of the mountains, knowing that somewhere up there in the high places she's still waiting, still walking, still watching, still offering the same choice to anyone who climbs high enough and stays long enough to understand what it means to be truly, completely alone. The woman with the backward face, the last of the Cherokee, the first of the lost. She walks the ridges above Copper Creek, and she always will. Tommy Whitaker was 17 when he first heard the stories, sitting on the weathered porch of his grandfather's cabin in the hollers of eastern Kentucky. The old man's voice carried the weight of decades as he spoke of things that dwelt in the shadows between the ancient peaks, things that had been there long before the first settlers carved their lives from the unforgiving wilderness. Tommy had always been drawn to the mountains. Born and raised in the coal mining town of Harlan County, he knew these hills like the back of his calloused hands. His daddy worked the mines until black lung took him when Tommy was 12, and his mama cleaned houses for the wealthier folks in town until her heart gave out 3 years later. Now it was just him and Grandpa Ezra, living in the old cabin that had been in the Whitaker family for 5 generations. The autumn of 1987 painted the mountains in shades of fire and gold. Tommy spent his days hunting squirrel and rabbit, helping his grandfather tend the small garden behind the cabin, and exploring the countless trails that snaked through the ancient forests. He was a lean boy, all sinew and bone, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes the color of creek water after a storm. It was on one of these wandering afternoons that Tommy first glimpsed the boy in blue overalls. The sighting happened at the edge of Miller's Hollow, where the old logging road petered out into nothing more than a deer path. Tommy had been tracking a buck for the better part of an hour when movement caught his eye through the trees. A child stood perhaps 50 yards away, his back turned toward Tommy, dressed in faded blue overalls and a white cotton shirt. The boy appeared to be around 7 or 8 years old, with hair so pale it was almost white in the dappled sunlight. Something about the child's stillness unnerved Tommy. The boy stood motionless as a statue, head tilted slightly as if listening to something Tommy couldn't hear. No child stood that still, especially not in the woods, where every sound and shadow held the promise of adventure or danger. Tommy called out, his voice echoing off the surrounding ridges. The boy turned slowly, revealing a face that was both beautiful and terrible in its perfection. Skin like porcelain, eyes so blue they seemed to hold the entire sky, and a smile that made Tommy's blood run cold despite the warmth of the afternoon. The boy raised one small hand and beckoned. Every instinct Tommy possessed screamed at him to turn and run, but something deeper, something primal and predatory, whispered that he should follow. The child's smile widened, showing teeth white as fresh snow, and he turned away, walking deeper into the forest with an odd gliding gait that barely disturbed the fallen leaves. Tommy found his feet moving before his mind could object. He followed the boy through stands of hickory and oak, past moss-covered boulders that looked like sleeping giants, down into valleys where the air grew thick and strange. The boy stayed always just ahead, never looking back, never stumbling despite the treacherous terrain. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time seemed to flow differently in the boy's wake, like honey poured from a jar. The familiar landmarks of Tommy's childhood wilderness began to fade, replaced by trees that seemed too large, too old, their branches reaching toward a sky that had somehow grown darker despite the sun's position overhead. It was only when Tommy heard his grandfather's voice calling his name from somewhere far behind that the spell broke. The sound cut through the strange lethargy that had settled over his mind, like a blade through silk. Tommy shook his head, blinking hard, and suddenly found himself standing alone in a grove of ancient pines he'd never seen before. The boy was gone. Tommy ran then, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs, with a desperation that bordered on panic. He followed the sound of his grandfather's voice, that blessed familiar sound that meant home and safety and sanity. When he finally burst from the tree line behind the cabin, Grandpa Ezra was standing on the porch with the old shotgun in his hands, his weathered face creased with worry. The old man's eyes searched Tommy's face, reading something there that made his expression grow grim. Without a word, he handed Tommy a cup of strong coffee laced with whiskey and waited until the boy's hands stopped shaking before he spoke. That night, sitting by the crackling fire, Grandpa Ezra told Tommy about the boy in blue overalls. The story had been passed down through generations of mountain folk, whispered around campfires, and shared in the safety of locked houses when the wind howled through the peaks. The boy had first been seen in 1923, according to the oldest accounts. A child of perhaps 7 or 8, wearing clothes that marked him as one of the poor mountain families that scratched out a living in the remote hollers. But as the years passed, people began to notice something wrong. The boy never aged, never grew, never changed. He appeared at the edges of settlements, always alone, always smiling that perfect, terrible smile. Those who followed him were never seen again. Some said he was the ghost of a child who had died in the mountains, cursed to wander forever. Others whispered that he was something older, something that had dwelt in the deep places since before the Cherokee walked these ridges. The old-timers spoke of him in the same hushed tones they used for other mountain spirits. The woman in white who walked the ridge roads, the black dogs that howled warnings of death, the things that moved in the deepest hollers where the sun never shone. Tommy listened to every word, storing them away like precious stones. When his grandfather finished, the old man fixed him with a stare that seemed to see straight through to his soul. The boy would return, Grandpa Ezra said. He always did. And when he came back, Tommy would have to make a choice. Winter came early that year, blanketing the mountains in snow and ice that turned the world into a crystal cathedral. Tommy helped his grandfather tend the fire and maintain their small herd of goats, but his mind kept returning to that afternoon in Miller's Hollow. In his dreams, he saw the boy's perfect face and felt the pull of that beckoning hand. Spring arrived with a riot of dogwood blossoms and the musical chatter of returning birds. Tommy's 18th birthday passed quietly, marked only by a store-bought cake and his grandfather's blessing. He had grown taller over the winter, his shoulders broadening with the promise of manhood. But inside he felt hollow, as if something essential had been carved out of him and left empty. The boy returned on a morning in late May, when the mountain laurel was in full bloom and the air hummed with the lazy drone of bees. Tommy saw him first as a flicker of movement at the edge of the clearing, a splash of blue against the green backdrop of the forest. This time, the boy didn't try to hide. He stood openly in the morning sunlight, his pale hair catching the light like spun gold, his impossible blue eyes fixed on Tommy with an intensity that made the young man's breath catch in his throat. Tommy's grandfather was in town, having walked the 5 miles to the general store for supplies. The cabin sat silent and empty behind Tommy, and the weight of solitude pressed down on him like a physical thing. The boy smiled, and Tommy felt his resolve crumble like autumn leaves. This time, when the boy turned and walked into the forest, Tommy didn't hesitate. He followed, leaving behind the safety of the cabin and the life he had known. The boy led him through secret paths and hidden valleys, past streams that sang with voices Tommy almost recognized, deeper into the heart of the mountains than any living person had ever gone. The forest grew stranger as they traveled. Trees twisted into impossible shapes, their bark gleaming with an oily iridescence that hurt to look at directly. Flowers bloomed in colors that had no names, their petals opening and closing in rhythm with some unheard heartbeat. The very air seemed to thicken, becoming almost liquid, and Tommy found himself moving through it as if swimming through honey. Time became meaningless. Tommy walked for what felt like hours, or perhaps days, following the boy's pale form through landscapes that shifted and changed like something from a fever dream. Mountains rose and fell around them, ancient and terrible, their peaks lost in clouds that roiled with strange lights. The boy never looked back, never slowed, never showed any sign of fatigue. Tommy ran then, crashing through the impossible forest as it writhed and shifted around him. Trees reached out with grasping branches. Flowers screamed as he passed, and the ground beneath his feet felt soft and yielding, like flesh. Behind him, the boy's cry rose to a pitch that made the mountains themselves shudder, and Tommy knew that something fundamental had been broken in that clearing, some barrier between worlds that had held for countless centuries. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out, collapsing finally at the edge of a stream that looked blessedly normal. The water was clear and cold, and when he cupped it in his hands and drank, it tasted of minerals and earth and all the familiar flavors of home. Tommy followed the stream for what felt like hours, though the sun never seemed to move in the sky. Eventually, he heard the sound of human voices, and he stumbled out of the forest to find himself on the old logging road, just a few hundred yards from his grandfather's cabin. Grandpa Ezra was waiting on the porch, and the relief in the old man's eyes was so profound that Tommy nearly broke down weeping. His grandfather didn't ask any questions, just helped Tommy inside and sat him down by the fire with a cup of that whiskey-laced coffee. It was only then that Tommy realized what was different. The pull was gone. The strange compulsion that had drawn him to follow the boy had vanished completely, leaving him feeling empty but clean, like a fever that had finally broken. Over the following weeks, Tommy learned what had happened from the whispered conversations of the mountain folk. The boy in blue overalls had been seen throughout the region, appearing at the edges of settlements and crossroads, beckoning to anyone who would look. But something had changed. The boy's appearances grew more frantic, more desperate, as if he was running out of time. Then, one morning, old Mrs. Henderson from down the valley came knocking on their door. She was a woman in her 70s, bent with age but still sharp as a tack, and she carried with her news that made Grandpa Ezra's face go pale. Her grandson Michael, a boy of 16, had been found that morning at the edge of the old cemetery, standing perfectly still with his eyes fixed on something only he could see. When they tried to speak to him, he didn't respond. When they tried to move him, he resisted with a strength that seemed impossible for his slight frame. Tommy knew immediately what had happened. The boy in blue overalls, denied his prize, had found another way to feed. Unable to lure the living into his realm, he had begun to claim them where they stood, trapping their souls while their bodies remained behind like empty shells. More cases followed. Children and young adults found standing motionless in fields and forests, their eyes fixed on invisible visions, their minds locked away in whatever world the boy had created for them. The afflicted could be cared for, fed and watered like livestock, but they never spoke, never moved of their own volition, never showed any sign of the people they had once been. Tommy felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a yoke. He had broken something in that clearing, had disrupted some ancient balance, and now others were paying the price. The boy's hunger had to be fed, and if he couldn't take souls to his realm, he would take them wherever he found them. Grandpa Ezra, perhaps sensing his grandson's guilt, told him stories of the old ways, the rituals and protections that the mountain folk had developed over generations of living alongside the strange and the terrible. Salt scattered at doorways, iron nails driven into windowsills, prayers spoken in languages that predated Christianity, all the accumulated wisdom of a people who had learned to survive in a world where the impossible was merely unlikely. But Tommy knew that these small protections wouldn't be enough. The boy's power was growing, spreading like a cancer through the mountains. Soon, the entire region would be filled with the hollow-eyed remnants of his feeding, and the thing that wore the face of a child would be strong enough to reach beyond the Appalachian peaks, to spread its influence across the world. The answer came to Tommy in a dream, or perhaps a vision sent by the same mountain spirits his grandfather had taught him to respect. He saw the circle of standing stones, not as it existed in the boy's realm, but as it had been built, long ago, by people who understood the dangers that dwelt in the spaces between worlds. The stones were not just markers or decorations, they were a prison, a cage built to contain something that should never have been allowed to roam free. The boy in blue overalls was not some lost spirit or ancient demon. He was a guardian, a warden whose job was to keep something far worse from escaping into the world. But the prison had been weakened, corrupted by decades of feeding on human souls. The boy himself had become infected by the very thing he was meant to contain, transformed from protector to predator. And now, with the barrier broken, both the boy and his charge were free to wreak havoc on the world. Tommy understood what he had to do, though the knowledge sat in his stomach like a stone. He would have to return to the clearing, to face the boy again. But this time, he wouldn't be running away. This time, he would be running toward something far more dangerous than a hungry spirit. He spent days preparing, gathering the tools and materials his grandfather's stories had described. Salt from the ocean, carried by traders across hundreds of miles. Iron forged in the old way, shaped by fire and hammer and human will. Words of power, written in languages that had been old when the first humans climbed down from the trees. The night before he left, Grandpa Ezra gave him a gift, a small leather pouch that had belonged to Tommy's great-grandmother, filled with herbs and stones and other things that had been passed down through generations of mountain women. The old man's eyes were bright with tears as he pressed it into Tommy's hands. Tommy set out at dawn, following paths that seemed to shift and change as he walked. The forest was different now, infected by the boy's growing power. Trees grew in impossible configurations, their roots reaching toward the sky while their branches burrowed into the earth. Animals watched him pass with eyes that held too much intelligence, and the very air seemed to whisper secrets in languages he was grateful not to understand. The journey took him through landscapes that existed in no geography textbook. Valleys where the sun never shone, peaks that scraped the belly of the sky, rivers that flowed upward toward invisible sources. Reality had become negotiable in the boy's domain, subject to revision and interpretation. Eventually, Tommy found himself back at the clearing, though it bore little resemblance to the place he had fled months before. The circle of standing stones had grown, expanding outward in concentric rings, and the symbols carved into their surfaces writhed and shifted like living things. At the center, where the boy had stood, there was now a pit, a hole in the world that seemed to lead down into infinite darkness. The boy was nowhere to be seen, but Tommy could feel his presence like a weight pressing down on his shoulders. The air in the clearing was thick with malevolence, and every breath tasted of copper and ash. Tommy began to work, using the tools and knowledge his grandfather had given him. He scattered salt in patterns that hurt to look at directly, drew symbols in the earth with iron nails, and spoke words that seemed to burn his throat as they passed his lips. The clearing resisted his efforts, reality bending and twisting around him. But Tommy pressed on, driven by the knowledge that failure meant not just his own death, but the doom of everyone he had ever known. As he worked, the boy began to manifest, first as a whisper at the edge of hearing, then as a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. Finally, he stood fully present at the edge of the circle, his perfect child's face twisted with rage and hunger. But Tommy could see through the mask now, could perceive the thing that lurked beneath. It was vast and ancient and utterly alien, a creature that had existed in the spaces between stars since before the earth was formed. It had been drawn to this place by something even older, something that slumbered in the depths beneath the mountains, and it had been trapped here by the wisdom of people who understood that some things were too dangerous to be allowed to roam free. The boy opened his mouth and spoke, and his voice was the sound of worlds ending, of suns going dark, of the last breath of the universe itself. He offered Tommy everything: power, knowledge, immortality, the ability to reshape reality according to his will. All he had to do was step into the circle, to join his soul to the thing that wore the boy's face, to become part of something greater than human comprehension. Tommy's response was to complete the ritual, to speak the final words that would repair the prison and restore the barriers between worlds. The boy's scream shattered the air, and the clearing began to collapse in on itself, reality folding and twisting as the ancient prison reasserted its hold. In the chaos, Tommy saw the truth of what lay beneath the mountains. Something vast and tentacled and utterly wrong, a creature that had been old when the first stars were born, dreaming its dreams of conquest and consumption in the deep places of the earth. The boy in blue overalls was nothing more than its shadow, its reflection cast upward into the world of light and life. As the prison sealed itself, Tommy felt the boy's rage wash over him like a tide of acid. The thing that wore the child's face promised him that this was not the end, that there would be other opportunities, other weaknesses to exploit. The barriers between worlds were thinning, and soon nothing would be able to contain the horrors that dwelt in the spaces between. But for now, the immediate danger was past. Tommy found himself standing in a perfectly normal forest clearing, surrounded by ordinary trees and ordinary stones. The pit at the center of the circle was gone, filled in with earth and covered by a carpet of fallen leaves. The boy in blue overalls was nowhere to be seen. Tommy made his way home through familiar woods, following paths that led steadily downhill toward the valley where his grandfather's cabin waited. Behind him, the mountains stood silent and watchful, keeping their secrets as they had for countless generations. When he reached the cabin, Grandpa Ezra was waiting on the porch, and the old man's eyes held a mixture of relief and sorrow that Tommy understood without words. The immediate crisis was over, but the victory had come at a cost. The boy in blue overalls was contained but not destroyed. The thing beneath the mountains still slumbered, but its dreams were growing stronger. And Tommy, having touched the edges of that alien intelligence, would never be quite the same. He had seen too much, understood too much, to ever return to the simple life of a mountain boy. He was marked now, branded by his contact with forces that existed beyond human comprehension. In the days that followed, the hollow-eyed victims of the boy's feeding began to recover. Michael Henderson blinked and spoke his first words in weeks, asking his grandmother where he had been. Others followed, returning to themselves like sleepers waking from a shared nightmare. The mountains seemed to breathe easier, as if some great weight had been lifted from their shoulders. But Tommy knew that this was only a respite, not a victory. The boy in blue overalls was part of something larger, something that had been patient enough to wait for millennia, and would be patient enough to wait for millennia more. The prison would hold for now, but prisons could be broken, and the thing that dreamed beneath the mountains would not remain content with dreams forever. Tommy took up his grandfather's role as keeper of the old stories, learning the names and natures of all the things that dwelt in the dark places of the world. He taught the young ones to recognize the signs, to know when to run and when to stand their ground, to understand that the mountains were beautiful and terrible and utterly indifferent to human concerns. And sometimes, on still nights when the wind was just right, Tommy would hear the sound of a child crying in the distance, lost and alone and calling for someone to follow him home. But Tommy had learned to close his ears to such sounds, to lock his doors and wait for dawn, knowing that some invitations were too dangerous to accept. The boy in blue overalls was gone, but not forgotten. He lived on in the stories told around campfires, in the warnings passed down from parent to child, in the dreams of those who had been touched by his presence. He was a reminder that the world was larger and stranger than most people dared to imagine, and that sometimes the only thing standing between civilization and chaos was the wisdom of those who had learned to live with monsters. Tommy grew old in the mountains, his hair turning white and his back bending with the weight of years. He never married, never had children of his own, but he served as uncle and grandfather to half the county, teaching them the old ways and the old stories. When death finally came for him, it found him sitting on his porch, looking out at the peaks that had shaped his life, a small smile on his weathered face. The cabin passed to his great-nephew, a young man who had listened to Tommy's stories with the proper mixture of respect and skepticism. The boy would learn in time that the mountains were full of wonders and terrors in equal measure, and that some stories were true whether you believed in them or not. And deep in the forest, at the edge of a clearing that existed in no map, a circle of standing stones stood sentinel over something that should not be awakened. The boy in blue overalls was gone, but his legacy remained, a reminder that the world was vast and full of mysteries, and that some mysteries were better left unsolved. The mountains kept their secrets, as they always had, and the people who dwelt in their shadow learned to live with the knowledge that they were not alone in the world, that things older and stranger than human imagination shared the deep places of the earth. It was a hard wisdom, but a necessary one, and it had served the mountain folk well for generations beyond counting. In the end, that was perhaps the most important lesson of all, that survival sometimes meant accepting the existence of things that defied understanding, and that the greatest courage was not in facing the unknown, but in knowing when to turn away from it, to choose the light over the darkness, the familiar over the strange. The boy in blue overalls had offered Tommy a glimpse of infinity, and Tommy had chosen instead the finite world of human love and loss and connection. It was a smaller choice perhaps, but it was his own, and in making it, he had preserved not just his own soul, but the souls of all those who came after him. The mountains stood eternal, indifferent to human concerns, but the people who dwelt in their shadow had learned to find meaning in their brief lives, to create light in the darkness, to tell stories that would outlast the stones themselves. And in that perhaps lay the greatest victory of all, not the defeat of the darkness, but the affirmation of the light. Sarah Mae Briggs was 23 years old when she first heard the drumming that would change her life forever. She lived in a weathered cabin perched on the edge of Whispering Hollow, deep in the Appalachian mountains of eastern Kentucky, where her family had scratched out a living for 4 generations. The isolation suited her fine. She had her grandmother's herb garden, her father's old hunting rifle, and enough preserves to last through the harsh mountain winters. The autumn of 1983 had been particularly brutal. An early frost had killed most of the late harvest, and the first snows came in October, trapping Sarah Mae in her hollow for weeks at a time. It was during one of these long, silent nights that she first heard it, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to echo from the very bones of the mountain itself. At first, she dismissed it as the wind rattling the old cabin's shutters, or perhaps a woodpecker working late into the night. But as the sound continued, growing stronger with each passing hour, she realized it was something else entirely. The beat was too regular, too purposeful. It had the cadence of a drum, but unlike any drum she'd ever heard. The sound seemed to crawl through the walls, seeping into her bones and making her teeth ache. Sarah Mae had grown up on her grandmother's stories about the old days, when the mountains held secrets that decent folk didn't speak of in daylight. Tales of things that wandered the ridges after dark, of people who went into the woods and came back different, if they came back at all. She'd always figured them for nothing more than old wives' tales, stories meant to keep children from wandering too far from home. But now, huddled in her cabin with the drumming growing louder by the hour, she began to wonder if maybe her grandmother hadn't been spinning tales after all. The sound came every night for a week, always starting just after midnight and continuing until dawn. Sarah Mae stopped sleeping, instead sitting by her window with her father's rifle across her lap, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. The drumming seemed to be coming from somewhere deep in the hollow, perhaps from the old cave system that honeycombed the mountain's interior. On the 7th night, the drumming was accompanied by something else,
a low, mournful wailing that made Sarah May's blood run cold. The sound was almost human, but not quite. It rose and fell with the rhythm of the drumming, creating a horrible symphony that seemed to vibrate through the very air itself.
That's when she remembered the stories her grandmother used to tell about Ezekiel Thorne. Ezekiel had been a mountain man who'd lived in these parts back in the 1800s, a trapper and hunter who'd gradually withdrawn from human society until he became something of a legend. People said he'd gone mad from the isolation, that he'd developed a taste for things that civilized folk wouldn't even speak of. The stories claimed he'd started making drums from the hides of the animals he caught, but eventually, animals weren't enough. According to her grandmother, Ezekiel had begun hunting people, travelers who'd lost their way in the mountains, settlers who'd ventured too far from their homesteads. He'd skin them with the same care he'd once shown to deer and bear, stretching their hides over frames of bone and sinew to create instruments that produced sounds no earthly drum should make. The authorities had finally tracked him down to a cave deep in the mountain, but when they'd arrived, they'd found only the drums. Dozens of them, made from human skin and mounted on stands carved from human bone. Ezekiel himself had vanished, leaving behind only the terrible instruments and the lingering echo of their otherworldly music. Sarah May had always assumed the story was just mountain folklore, the kind of grisly tale that got passed down through generations and grew more elaborate with each telling. But now, listening to the drumming that seemed to come from the very heart of the mountain, she wasn't so sure. The eighth night brought a blood moon, casting everything in an eerie crimson glow that made the shadows dance and writhe like living things. The drumming started earlier than usual, beginning just as the moon reached its zenith. But this time, it was different. The rhythm was more complex, more urgent, as if the drummer were calling out to something or someone. Sarah May watched from her window as shapes began to move in the tree line. At first, she thought they might be deer or other forest creatures, but as they came closer, she realized they were walking upright. Human figures, or something that had once been human, shuffled through the underbrush with jerky, unnatural movements. The figures were heading toward the sound of the drumming, drawn by its hypnotic rhythm like moths to a flame. Sarah May counted at least a dozen of them, their pale forms barely visible in the moonlight. They moved with purpose, following some invisible path that led deeper into the hollow. As the last of the figures disappeared into the darkness, Sarah May made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her days. She grabbed her rifle, pulled on her boots, and stepped out into the night. The drumming was much louder outside the cabin, so loud it seemed to make the very ground vibrate beneath her feet. She followed the sound, picking her way carefully through the underbrush by the light of the blood moon. The path led her deeper into the hollow than she'd ever gone before, past the old-growth trees and into a part of the mountain that seemed untouched by human presence. The cave mouth opened before her like a gaping wound in the mountainside, black and forbidding. The drumming was coming from somewhere deep inside, echoing off the stone walls and creating a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah May hesitated at the entrance, every instinct screaming at her to turn back, but something compelled her forward. The cave tunnel sloped downward, leading her into the belly of the mountain. The walls were smooth and damp, carved by centuries of flowing water. Strange symbols had been scratched into the stone, crude pictographs that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering light of her flashlight. As she descended, the drumming grew louder, joined by other sounds, chanting in a language she didn't recognize, the scraping of bone against stone, and that awful wailing that seemed to come from tortured throats. The air grew thick and humid, carrying with it the smell of decay and something else, something that made her stomach turn. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow. In the center of the space, illuminated by the dancing light of torches, stood a figure that might once have been human. It was tall and gaunt, its skin stretched tight over sharp bones, its eyes nothing more than hollow sockets that seemed to stare into her very soul. The creature was playing a drum, its long skeletal fingers dancing across the surface with inhuman speed and precision. But this was no ordinary drum. The instrument was made from human skin. Sarah May could tell that much immediately. The surface was pale and translucent, marked with the faint outlines of what had once been a face. Around the chamber, the pale figures she'd seen in the forest stood swaying in time with the rhythm, their movements mechanical and lifeless. They were people, Sarah May realized with growing horror, or they had been once. Now they were something else entirely, hollow shells animated by the will of the drummer. The creature's head turned toward her, and Sarah May found herself staring into those empty eye sockets. A smile spread across its face, revealing teeth that had been filed to sharp points. It raised one hand from the drum, beckoning her forward with a gesture that was almost gentle. Sarah May felt her feet begin to move of their own accord, carrying her toward the drummer, despite every fiber of her being screaming at her to run. The rhythm of the drum seemed to synchronize with her heartbeat, drawing her deeper under its spell with each step. She was halfway across the chamber when the creature's smile faltered. Its hollow gaze shifted to something behind her, and for the first time, the drumming hesitated. Sarah May heard footsteps echoing from the tunnel entrance, heavy boots on stone. The spell broken, she turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows. An old man in a tattered coat, his face lined with years of hard living. He carried a rifle in his hands, and his eyes held the kind of knowledge that came from seeing too much of the world's darkness. The old man raised his rifle and fired, the shot echoing through the chamber like thunder. The bullet struck the drummer's center mass, but instead of falling, the creature merely staggered backward, its smile never wavering. Where the bullet had hit, a dark ichor began to seep from the wound, but the drummer continued to play. The old man worked the bolt of his rifle, chambering another round. His voice, when he spoke, was gravelly and worn, like stone grinding against stone. He told Sarah May to run, to get out of the cave while she still could. But she found herself frozen in place, caught between the hypnotic pull of the drum and the terror of what she was witnessing. The drummer's rhythm changed, becoming more frantic, more desperate. The pale figures around the chamber began to move, shuffling toward the old man with outstretched arms. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. The old man fired again, and again, each shot finding its mark, but doing little to slow the advancing horde. Sarah May watched in horror as the figures surrounded him, their pale hands reaching out to tear at his clothing, his flesh. In that moment, something inside her snapped. The spell of the drum was broken, replaced by a rage she'd never felt before. She raised her own rifle and fired, the shot taking the nearest figure in the head. The creature crumpled to the cave floor, its body dissolving into dust and bone. The drummer's rhythm faltered again, and Sarah May saw her chance. She charged forward, using the butt of her rifle to strike the drum. The instrument cracked under the impact, and the sound that emerged was like the scream of a dying animal. The creature that had been Ezekiel Thorne let out a wail of rage and pain, its form beginning to waver and fade. The remaining pale figures collapsed to the ground, their strings cut by the damage to their master's instrument. But the drummer wasn't finished. With a final, desperate effort, it brought its hands down on the cracked surface of the drum. The sound that emerged was like nothing Sarah May had ever heard, a deep, resonant boom that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. The cave began to collapse around them, chunks of stone falling from the ceiling like rain. The old man grabbed Sarah May's arm and pulled her toward the tunnel entrance, both of them running as the chamber came apart behind them. They made it out of the cave just as the entrance collapsed, sealing the drummer and its instruments beneath tons of rock and earth. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing and the distant hoot of an owl. The old man introduced himself as Samuel Whitmore, a hunter who'd been tracking the drummer for over 40 years. He'd been too late to save others, but he'd managed to save Sarah May. He told her that the creature would eventually find another way out, that evil like that couldn't be buried forever. Sarah May left the hollow the next day, packing what little she owned and heading for the nearest town. She never spoke of what she'd seen in the cave, never told anyone about the drummer or the pale figures that had danced to its rhythm. But sometimes on nights when the moon runs red and the wind howls through the mountains, she thinks she can still hear it, the faint echo of drumming, calling out from somewhere deep beneath the earth. And she knows that somewhere in the darkness, Ezekiel Thorne is still playing his terrible music, waiting for the chance to add another voice to his chorus of the damned. The mountains keep their secrets, and some secrets are better left buried. But the drumming continues, patient and eternal, a reminder that some hungers can never be satisfied, and some evils can never truly die. Years later, when hikers go missing in the Appalachian wilderness, when campers report strange sounds echoing through the night, Sarah May wonders if the drummer has found a way to continue his work. The mountains are vast and full of hidden places, and she knows that somewhere in their depths, the rhythm continues. The drum beats on, calling to the lost and the lonely, promising them a place in its eternal dance. And sometimes, just sometimes, someone answers that call, disappearing into the darkness to become another pale figure swaying to the rhythm of human skin stretched over bone. The hollow remains empty now, reclaimed by the forest. But on blood moon nights, when the crimson light bathes the mountains in its eerie glow, the drumming echoes through the valleys once more, a reminder that some hungers never die, and some musicians never stop playing their terrible songs.